Bad turnouts. Bad turnouts. I'm showing you how to replace bad turnouts on your model railroad layout on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Anyone who's had a model railroad layout for any period of time knows that ultimately there's going to be some maintenance and repair required on that layout. Track is no exception to this. Over time, track gets damaged from use and from abuse. Things get dropped and set on it. Turnouts especially can wear out over time and can be subject to a certain amount of wear and tear. And sometimes, somewhere along the course of the history of your layout, you're going to have to replace some turnouts. Well, I'm going to have to do exactly that job today. I have a bad turnout that's been damaged over time, and I'm going to have to go in and cut it out and replace it with a new one. And I'm going to show you exactly how I do that, and hopefully it'll help you as you have to do similar jobs on your layout in the future. Do you have some maintenance issues that you'd like to know more about in future episodes of Ron's Trains and Things? If so, tell me about it in the comment section down below. So let's head on over to the layout and we'll get started. Now this turnout that we're looking at right here is the turnout that we're having an issue with. Now this is in my ladder, my yard ladder in North Yard, and several of these turnouts in the ladder were salvaged from a previous layout. In fact, part of this ladder was a ladder that was taken intact off of my previous layout. And for the most part, I've had little problem, except for this turnout right here. The problem I have is these are Exzel frog turnouts, so the frogs are plastic. And whenever I reinstalled this ladder on the new layout, apparently I got this joint right here on the diverging route of this turnout a little too hot. And it was actually quite some time before I realized it. I didn't see it at first. It wasn't until I started running trains that I realized that I had a real derailment problem right here. In fact, I've got a few cars lined up here, and I'll show you exactly what it does as we shove a cut of cars back into this particular classification track. And I'm moving very slowly here, so which is as you would do in a yard with yard switching operations. And some trucks will make it through, but you see the big bump every time a car goes through it. Every time a truck goes over that frog, you see that big jump, and there it went. You saw the derailment right there. In most cases, when you're taking a turnout out, you're going to want to replace it with the same turnout that you're putting back. Otherwise, you're going to have to make some major adjustments. I'm going to be replacing this with another Pico right-hand Exzel frog medium radius turnout, exactly like this one. So it should fit in here perfectly as this one does. If I was putting a different brand or a different size of turnout in here, then I would have to make some real adjustments to the track, both on the through route and the diverging route in order to make that happen. So just be aware of that. To remove this turnout, we're going to cut it out of its place here. Now, obviously, this was a component that we were trying to save in some way. We would need to take a completely different method. But this turnout is pretty well ruined, so there's nothing to save here. So, since I'm not trying to salvage it, I'm going to actually cut it out of place. Now, the thing I want to make sure that I do is I want to make sure that when I cut it, number one, I want to cut it well short of the actual joints themselves, because I don't want to damage the other turnouts or rail that is coming in contact with it, where I'm going to be installing the new turnout. I also want to cut it in such a place as to not run the risk of damaging adjacent rails. Like, for instance, this rail here, these rails are really close. So when I cut this, I want to make sure that I cut it very carefully so as not to get into this piece of rail. Now, I'm saying that because I'm going to be cutting this turnout out using my Dremel motor tool and a cutoff disc. I could cut this out with rail nippers, but rail nippers on existing track that's already installed can put a lot of twisting pressure on the rail sometimes. and can cause some problems with pulling up some of the adjacent rail. I don't want to run the risk. I think the cleanest way I can get this out is to cut it out with a motor tool. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to come in with a thin putty knife to pry this old turnout out with. Now when I say thin, putty knives come in different thicknesses. You can see this putty knife is very thin and flexible. This turnout was glued down using latex adhesive caulk, and so that can stick pretty tight. So I want to be careful to pry it up and try to get underneath it as much as I can so that I can pry it up without tearing up the cork that's underneath. I don't want to have to replace that if I can keep from it. And I can do this from both sides. And just going to try to work it in there. And as I do, I can kind of cut some of that caulk. If we're careful and take our time, as you see, beginning to get this up, I think we're getting it without really damaging the cork. Again, what's called for here is just patience, and take your time just a little bit. Sometimes, a lot of times with my turnouts that I lay now, I don't glue them down quite as intensely as this. Sometimes what I literally do is I'll glue a turnout just by putting a spot of caulk basically under the frog, and just a spot up here at the end past the points, and that's sometimes enough to hold it down, but these I glued down more completely. And there you see, I got it up. A little damage to the cork here, but I think that's going to be okay. We're going to come and clean that up. I'm just going to try to pull a little of that old caulk off of there now, as I can do it without further damaging the cork. And I'm going to see, there's quite a bit of caulk right there where it kind of squeezed up between the ties, and I want to get some of that up because I don't want it to be rough. I don't want enough of that caulk left on there that's going to be rough and it's going to hold my turnout up. Where there is some of this damage to the cork, where there's some little divots, I'm going to glue the new turnout down with caulk just like I did the old one. And so honestly, I can fill some of those divots with some of that latex caulk, kind of smooth it over, and that will make that, you know, come out pretty good. And in fact, of course, I use gray caulk, as you can see here, and once we get that turnout in and then get it ballasted, you'll never know that that is there. Now that I've cleaned up some of the loose cork with my miniature vacuum, now it's time to come in and remove these little nibs of rail that are left from the turnout that we've cut out, still connected to the adjoining rails, and also the old rail joiners that are connected here as well. To do this, we're going to go in with a soldering iron, and we're going to apply some heat. We want to apply it to the existing rail that we want to leave right at the rail joiner, just enough to loosen the solder. And I'm going to use these needle nose pliers to try to pull it away. I don't want to leave the heat on this rail any longer than I have to, because I don't want to melt the ties and cause more problem like what we had. So we're going to come in. I've got the rail nib, the piece that's left, firmly gripped along with the rail joiner. I'm going to come in and apply some heat right here, back and forth, and at the same time pull on that piece and try to loosen it up and pull it loose as quickly as possible. Trying not to allow that to get so hot as to melt the ties on the existing track. There it comes. Okay, we got that one loose. And we just need to repeat that process on all of these pieces of rail. But again, we just want to pull these loose as quickly as we can so as not to melt the tie. If we do melt the tie, I can always cut a tie out and replace it. but obviously if we can keep from having to do that, it's best. Okay, there are those 4, and then have the 2 on the other end here to work on also. Doing this a little backwards here, but I think I can do it from here. And you notice as those little pieces of rail come off, the old rail joiners are coming right off with them, which is exactly what we want. We'll use all new rail joiners, of course, as we do this. Oh, shoot. Now, see right there, I did exactly what I didn't want to do. I got that hot, and I pulled that loose, and the entire piece of stock rail out of this turnout here came loose, which means now, instead of replacing 1 turnout, I'm going to be replacing 2. So we're going to stop here, and we're going to go in and we're going to cut this turnout out because that can't be repaired. I'll have to pull this one out as well. Okay, now I'm kind of back to where I was. I got this other turnout taken out. Fortunately, I happen to have another right-hand turnout on hand, but I want to be very, very careful going forward not to repeat that. So I got these nibs taken off of these tracks. I need to take off the 2 here, but I'm going to start here. This is where I had the problem a while ago, and I want to make sure that I don't have a repeat of that same incident, hopefully. There it comes. Okay, so I'm going to bring in my NMRA gauge and run it through here just to make sure that is going to be okay. And it is worked its way in a little bit, but there. I think I've got it back in place. Now that we have all those little pieces of rail removed, because this track was painted, and also because we have little bits of solder in there, I'm going to come in with a small file, and I'm just going to file those rails just a little bit to remove any paint that may interfere with the solder, and also to remove any solder that might be left and cause a problem for my rail joiners going on. Now I'm going to come in with 2 of these Pico Streamline Code 80 Exzel Frog medium radius turnouts. If you're looking for a part number, that's Pico part number SL395. And going to be using a pair of these to replace the turnouts that I just removed. And as we set these in here, you'll see that they'll fit just perfectly in place. And it'll be really easy to put these in. I need to do a little bit of prep on the turnouts themselves, before we're ready to put them in. And mainly what we need to do is we need to prepare them to take the rail joiners. Of course, as with almost any flex track or anything else, we've got to remove 1 tie off of each end in order to make room for the rail joiner, because the spike detail won't allow the rail joiner to slide on. Now with the Picos on the diverging end, the way they make their ties, we have this long tie that goes across both tracks here, and then here you have a tie that goes across here, and then this tie is at an angle here, and these actually kind of come together right here, and this is actually one piece, one tie, these 2 together here. And so I try to cut these with a hobby knife in such a way as to leave this second tie straight. Now I'm going to cut this off, and as I remove this tie, this connecting pieces of plastic, I want to take all of that off back to the second tie, just to get it out of the way of the rail joiners. There we go. We'll remove that tie. We're going to set it aside and hold on to it. And then on the other end, we're just going to remove the first tie. And again, we'll remove those plastic joiners that connect the ties together all the way back to the second tie. Oops. There we go. And hold on to those ties because we'll want them to put back into place. I'm installing the rail joiners on all these joints, and I went ahead and put the rail joiners on and connected these two turnouts together. I have not soldered them, they're just connected with the rail joiners. And then on these two pieces of rail and this one here, I'm installing the rail joiners and sliding them all the way onto the rail so that I can then put this in place and then slide them back onto these turnouts. Now I want to show you just how I do this. You don't need to watch me do all of these because installing rail joiners is not very exciting, but I wanted you to see this little tool. Some people suggested this after a previous video that I did about installing rail joiners in a way similar to this. And this is literally just a piece of rail that I have put in a pair of pliers and bent at the end. And then I also took a file and just tapered the foot of the rail on the end. And this allows me, I don't know how well you can see this, but that allows the rail joiner to slip onto this rail fairly easily. I say fairly easily, and then it won't go on. There we go, fairly easily. And then it'll only go as far as that bend, and then that gives me a handle, especially down low like this on track that's already installed, gives me a handle to get in here and get that rail joiner started. There, got that started. And once I get it started on the rail like that, take some needle nose pliers. I'm going to work it onto that rail just a little long further. And then I'm going to come around here and hold it onto that rail with the needle nose pliers. Good and tight, and pull that off. And there I have my rail joiner started. Now, again, in this point case, I want to push the rail joiner all the way up onto this rail. So I'm going to carefully push that up just like that, and there, it's all the way back on this piece of rail. And that's what I'm doing with each of these. Now, I have all of my rail joiners installed on the existing track. This last set of rail joiners here, I didn't slide all the way on, I just put halfway on, because that's where I'm going to begin installing my, my new turnouts. And so I can just slide them onto these rail joiners like I would if I was working on all new track. So I'm going to carefully get those lined up and slide those right into place. And there, got a nice tight joint there, and those are just right. And then all of these come down and they fit right into place. And so then what I'm going to do with these others is I'm going to come back and fit them in. I want to make sure I don't have any humps in there that's holding my track up. I'm going to come in and just use my needle nose pliers and slide these other rail joiners back onto the new rail, the new turnouts. Now that can be a trick sometimes, getting them lined up and getting them started. But they should go on a little easier here than they did, you know, going on for the first time, because they're already on a rail. So, you know, if they were a little tight, they should be spread out now. There we go. Okay, and that has all of my rail joiners in place. Now I'm going to come in with my NMRA gauge and just make sure that everything is engaged all the way through, and that's all really good. That is all really good. My joints are nice and tight. That's good there. This one is really good. And this one here, this is the one I was a little worried about, because this is where I had that little piece of rail that kind of got hot. It looks like the gauge is good on that too. So I think we should be in really good shape. I'm just going to feel these and make sure I don't have any big, unusual, gaps or any rails that are accidentally sticking up that didn't get in the rail joiners. But those all feel like they are really, really good. And so with that, I think we're ready to solder some rail joints. Now with all my rail joiners in place, before I go to soldering these in place, I need to put just a little bit of adhesive underneath these to hold them in place. I've got just a little bit of latex caulk and put just a little bit on this board, and I'm going to come in with my putty knife, and I'm going to just carefully slip a little up under here. Now I want to stay away from the area where the points are. I don't want to glue them in place, and I don't need a lot of this. The other rail is all glued down really well, so it's going to mostly hold this in place, but just a little to give us just a little bit of insurance here. So again, I'm just going to slide a little of that up underneath the central part, the frog area specifically. Now with that, we are ready to start soldering our rail joints together. First, I'm going to come in with just a little bit of Flux on a micro brush. I'm using kind of a soft paste Flux. And I'm going to do all my soldering on the outside of the rail. I don't want anything on the inside of the rail that's going to interfere with the flanges. So I'm going to put my Flux on the outside of the rail, all on the length of the rail joiner on every joint. This Flux, of course, helps to clean the rail and the joiner, and allows the solder to flow nice and evenly. I'm going to kind of wipe any off of the heads of the rail, because we want to keep the solder off the heads of the rail if we can, as much as we possibly can. I'm going to put just a little bit of solder on the tip of my soldering iron, and I just want a little. I don't need too much, and that's going to be the amount of solder I need to solder these together. And as I touch my soldering iron, I'll begin to see the Flux burn away, and I'm going to just move that back and forth a little bit to apply heat over the full length of the rail joiner, and the solder will flow right into the joint. And when we finish with our solder joint should be a nice shiny silver color. A dull colored solder joint is a joint that was a cold joint that didn't get hot enough, and is not going to be a strong joint. So we're just going to do this on each one of those, and as soon as we see the solder flow through the joint, we know we should have plenty of adhesion. Got some solder on my soldering iron still. The quicker we can get on and off of the joint and have a good solder, the less chance we're going to take of melting ties and causing damage. And that has all of our joints soldered together. Now those have had plenty of time to cool, these ones that I started with up here. So I'm going to come up here and just make sure that I don't have any solder in places that are going to interfere with the wheels or with the flanges. And I can kind of tell that just by feeling them. If there's anything that's going to be a problem for flanges, you can feel it with your finger. Now with all my solder joints complete, I'm coming in with just a little bit of denatured alcohol that I've got in this lid and an old toothbrush, and I'm going to come in and clean away any remaining flux. That flux is very sticky, has a very sticky residue, and it does not really go away over time unless you clean it off, and also it will keep paint from adhering to your track. So when you go to paint your track, you're going to have a hard time getting the paint to stick. For our last step, we need to go and put in some filler ties in these areas where we cut some of these ties out for the sake of our rail joiners. And so what I've done is I've gone back and taken the ties that that we had cut out, and I used a number 17 chisel blade and just scraped the spike head detail off of these, sanded the bottom of them just a little bit to thin them down, and then I can come back and just slide these into place, basically right where I took them out. And I don't need to glue these in place right now. Friction will hold them in place for the moment, and then when we come back and put down our ballast, the ballast and the adhesive will hold them in place permanently at that point. Also, where I've scraped the spike head detail off, you see these little white marks, but I'll be coming back to paint this track, and that will cover up at that point. This was that double tie that I put in just a moment ago, and this is a single here, and space those just a little bit, and there we have that. That has that filled back in and looking really good. And so I'm going to come back and now that this has had some time to all kind of dry, I'm going to come back with at this point a Bright Boy and just run over this real quickly just to clean it off, and then I think we'll be ready to test our new switches. Well, even with my mishap in damaging a second turnout, these two new turnouts seem to be running really well. They need a little bit of fine tuning, and I will work on tweaking those things as I go forward. But after running trains back and forth through them for quite some time, I've had 0 derailments, and that ultimately is a fix to that problem. So if you have problems with turnouts on your layout that need to be replaced, I hope these steps and these suggestions will help you as you think about going in and doing those repairs and that maintenance on your layout. Well, if you enjoyed this video, here's a link to some more videos I know you'll enjoy as well. I also hope you'll take a moment to check out the description down below this video. There you're going to find links to my Amazon page, my Amazon Pick of the Week, as well as my Patreon page and the rewards for those who invest in Ron's Trains and Things over his time. You'll also find some links where you can connect with me on a variety of social media, and I look forward to connecting with you. I hope you'll join me again next Tuesday as I'll be bringing you another great model railroad segment, and I look forward to seeing you then. Lizzie?